Bryan Callen. Photo, Santiago Felipe. Getty Images. A little over a month after comedian Chris D'Elia was accused of sexual misconduct, one of his closest friends is also at the center of allegations. According to a new report from the LA Times, 4 women have gone on the record to accuse comedian and The Goldbergs star Bryan Callen of sexual assault and misconduct. The allegations span back to 1999, when former MAD-TV cast member Catherine Fiori Tigerman alleges Callen raped her. Tigerman told The Times that she watched the allegations against D'Elia play out last month, and when Callen's name began to be mentioned she felt relief, and thought, "Oh, I'm not by myself in this. I finally feel powerful against him. And if I can give that feeling to somebody else, that would be great." Like Tigerman, 3 other women shared their allegations against Callen in detail with The Times. A former American Apparel employee named Rachel Green accused Callen of pinning her against a dressing room wall in 1999 and kissing her, which she immediately reported to her coworkers. Claire Ganchert, who was an aspiring actress when she met Callen in 2012 when she was 23 and working at a New York coffee shop, said she had a 4-year affair with Callen while he was married, and that he told her in 2016 that women have a biological, primal desire to be raped. A comedian named Tiffany King also alleged that, in 2017, Callen tried to pressure her to give him oral sex in exchange for stage time and money at a time when he knew that she was struggling financially. "It was so humiliating. He was somebody I looked up to as a comedian who had control over something I loved," King told The Times. "If it had been another woman, she could have done it and killed herself the next day because she felt so horrible." In a statement to The Times, Callen denied all of the allegations. "Let me be very clear, I have never raped, forced myself upon any woman nor offered to trade stage time for sex. Ever," his statement read, "I know the truth. And I can only hold my head up high, remain true to myself, my family, my audience and know that I will not allow the cancel culture to subvert what I know and as importantly, what they know, is the truth." Callen accused Ganchert of mudslinging in order to get her name in the press. Ganchert told The Times that what Callen did to her when she was young was more in the gray area, adding, "I think that story is relatable. I am not a victim but I'm standing up for that 23-year-old girl by saying that a 45-year-old man should have known better." Comedian Bryan Callen accused of rape and sexual misconduct. As soon as she saw his name, Catherine Fiori Tigerman broke out in a cold sweat. Her shirt damp, she scrolled through the text messages from her best friend alerting her that comedian Chris D'Elia was being accused of sexual misconduct by scores of women on Twitter. She'd never watched the comic's stand-up. She just knew that he was the best friend of Bryan Callen, a fellow comedian and actor. And Callen, she'd long told those closest to her, had once raped her. Lightheaded, she logged onto Twitter to scan the allegations. She found that many of the tweets referred not just to D'Elia's supposed misconduct but to that of his tight circle of male comedians. "My first thought was, is something going to happen with Bryan?" Tigerman recalled. "Reading all the comments, I thought, here it comes. I've known how terrible this person is for 20 years. And maybe I'm not the only one." In a statement to The Times, Callen adamantly denied raping Tigerman and said that their encounter was consensual. Tigerman is not the only woman to claim that Callen was sexually inappropriate with her. Since June 17, the day that D'Elia started trending on social media, 3 additional women told The Times that they had been mistreated by Callen, 53, describing troubling sexual incidents ranging from assault to misconduct to disturbing comments. Their stories suggest a pattern of behavior that spans decades, going back at least as far as 1999, when, Tigerman said, Callen held her down and forced her to have sex with him as she pleaded with him to stop. In the years since, 3 women claimed, the Goldbergs' actor continued to be both verbally and physically aggressive. An American Apparel saleswoman said that in 2009, Callen pinned her against the wall of a fitting room against her will and began to kiss her. An aspiring actress who had a 4-year affair with Callen while he was married said he told her in 2016 that women have a biological, primal desire to be raped. 1 year later, a female comedian said, he suggested she give him oral sex in exchange for stage time and money. Callen denied all of these accounts. "Let me be very clear, I have never raped, forced myself upon any woman nor offered to trade stage time for sex. Ever," he said in a statement to The Times. "I know the truth. And I can only hold my head up high, remain true to myself, my family, my audience, and know that I will not allow the cancel culture to subvert what I know, and as importantly, what they know, is the truth." In recent weeks, Callen has come to the defense of Delia, who said last month that he'd only ever had consensual relationships and hadn't, knowingly, pursued underage females. On a June 18 episode of his podcast, The Fighter and the Kid, Callen described Delia as a "ladies' man," whom he'd never seen or heard engaging in illegal activity. "And right now I have to believe that, because he's still a friend," he said. One home goods retailer has seen its sales soar during the coronavirus pandemic, with consumers flocking to its website and stores for new patio furniture and office accessories. And it has big goals to grow, while many retailers are slimming down, or some in its category like Pier 1 Imports are going out of business entirely. The CEO of Plano, Texas based At Home told CNBC's Kelly Evans Friday afternoon that the company could grow from the 219 locations it has today to more than 600 shops nationwide. "We're a growth company," Chief Executive Lee Bird said. "We've been growing almost 20% for the past 7 years." While some have been struggling through the COVID-19 crisis and seen sales tumble, At Home's business is booming, according to a recent preliminary earnings report. Earlier this week, At Home released preliminary, unaudited results for its latest quarter ended July 25. It said quarterly same-store sales are expected to be up 42%. And At Home's second quarter net income is forecast to be at least $82 million, with sales amounting to about $515 million. "We think this is going to last for some time," Bird said Friday about people investing in their homes. "People are going to feel a lot more comfortable staying at home than being out. After 9/11, people stayed at home, and that was a multi-year benefit for our industry." At Home shares have soared more than 123% this year. The company has a market cap of $778.6 million. David Heinemeier Hansson was "smiling broadly" by the end of Congress's grilling of the 4 big tech CEOs Wednesday. "I was frankly blown away," said Heinemeier Hansson, the co-founder of Basecamp, who was recently the central figure of a public dispute with Apple over its App Store rules. For Heinemeier Hansson, who previously testified before the committee about big tech's impact on startups, Wednesday's hearing exceeded his lukewarm expectations, in part by simply being mostly unembarrassing. He recalled past hearings where Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg was the lone focal point, and it seemed lawmakers were unprepared with the basic facts to confront him. But at Wednesday's hearing featuring Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, Apple CEO Tim Cook, Facebook's Zuckerberg, and Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google parent company Alphabet, many lawmakers centered their questions around the 1.3 million pieces of evidence the committee has collected in the past year of its probe. That rendered the rehearsed testimony from the CEOs less important, according to Heinemeier Hansson, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Heinemeier Hansson's optimism was shared by other tech rivals who have aired their grievances with the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, as well as enforcers around the world. Google's most consistent opponent, Yelp SVP of Public Policy Luther Lowe, said the hearing was a seismic event. Lowe has been steeped in the debate over Google's competition practices for nearly a decade. He's seen numerous regulators consider Yelp's complaints that Google has acted unjustly toward vertical search competitors by ripping off their content or using tactics that discourage users from clicking away from their results and onto other sites. Google agreed not to scrape websites like Yelp for content in its 2013 settlement with the Federal Trade Commission that ended its antitrust investigation. Google has maintained that its practices are not anti-competitive. After Google's then CEO Eric Schmidt testified to the Senate about the company's search practices in 2011, Lowe recalled feeling underwhelmed with the scrutiny on Google. But this time, he said, there was a more informed focus on the antitrust issues at play. What Congress is they send signals, Lowe said in an interview Thursday. If the signal in 2011 was, "Hey, FTC investigating Google. Why are you messing with this great company?" The message yesterday was, "Why didn't you go after for these companies yesterday?" Eddie Lazarus, chief legal officer at Sonos, was slightly more subdued in his optimism. Sonos is currently suing Google for patent infringement and has claimed both Google and Amazon artificially lower prices on their smart speakers to edge out competing products like their own. A hacker who was unsuccessful at attempting to place ransomware on a third-party software and cloud hosting provider for Cal State Northridge was able to get some customer data, school officials said in a letter to students this week. However, the third-party company, Blackbaud, said in a statement it paid a ransom to the hacker after the cybercriminal confirmed the stolen data had been deleted. Still, school officials said they had no way to independently verify that the stolen data was deleted, and recommended students regularly review their account statements and periodically obtain a credit report. Blackbaud discovered and stopped the ransom attack sometime in May, company officials said in a statement, but school officials said the hacker could have been trying to place ransomware on the network as early as February. Ransomware is used in an attempt to disrupt a business by locking companies out of their own data and servers, Blackbaud's statement said. But while the hacker was unsuccessful, the suspect did manage to get a subset of data from Blackbaud's self-hosted environment. More specific details were not disclosed. The cybercriminal did not access credit card information, bank account information or social security numbers, Blackbaud said. The customers affected were notified and supplied with information and resources, school officials said. Blackbaud provides services for numerous Cal State University schools, according to the CSUN letter, but it wasn't immediately known if others were at risk. School officials said it was troubling that Blackbaud waited 2 months to notify them of the cyberattack. The CSU system was working with Blackbaud to better understand what data was potentially exposed and what changes were being made to prevent another cyberattack, school officials said. Blackbaud said it believes the data did not get passed on beyond the hacker. It wasn't immediately known if the hacker had been identified or arrested. Based on the nature of the incident, our research, and third-party, including law enforcement investigation, we have no reason to believe that any data went beyond the cybercriminal, was or will be misused, or will be disseminated or otherwise made available publicly, the company's statement said. Eastern Conference contenders meet up on Friday in a highly anticipated matchup as the Boston Celtics take on the Milwaukee Bucks at 6:30 p.m. ET in the Orlando NBA bubble. The Celtics are one of the most balanced teams in the East, and they are hoping to have Kemba Walker in some capacity on Friday. The Bucks, who went into the shutdown up 6-5 games in the Eastern Conference standings, are powered by Giannis Antetokounmpo, who ranks third in the NBA in both scoring 29.6 ppg and rebounding 13.7 ppg. William Hill lists Milwaukee as a 4.5-point favorite, down half a point from the opening Bucks vs. Celtics line. The over-under for total points expected is 220. Before locking in any Celtics vs. Bucks picks, be sure to see the NBA predictions from the proven computer model at Sportsline. The Sportsline projection model simulates every NBA game 10,000 times, and it's already returned over $4,000 in profit on its top-rated NBA picks during the 2019-20 season. It also was a blistering 52-32 on all top-rated NBA spread picks before the coronavirus shutdown, returning almost $1,700 on those picks alone. Anybody who has followed it has seen huge returns. Now, the model has set its sights on Celtics vs. Bucks. You can head to Sportsline to see its picks. Here are several NBA betting lines and trends for Bucks vs. Celtics. Boston is a top 5 team in offensive and defensive efficiency. Jason Tatum's success as a breakout star was central in its development, with the talented forward making a genuine leap as an efficient, productive scorer. The Celtics are also stacked with other talent, namely in the form of Walker and Jaylen Brown, and few teams can match their perimeter firepower. Boston also takes care of the ball, committing turnovers on only 13.4% of possessions. The Celtics will need to maximize possessions against a highly effective Bucks defense, and the team's off-dribble shooting capability could be crucial against Milwaukee's length and rim protection. The Bucks are a tremendous two-way team, with the best defense in basketball and a top 5 overall offense. Though scheme and balance are a part of that formula, Milwaukee relies heavily on the presence of the MVP frontrunner, Antetokounmpo. The 25-year-old is averaging 29.6 points, 13.7 rebounds and 5.8 assists per game and, on top of that, Antetokounmpo is a leading candidate for the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year award. It is possible that Milwaukee could limit his minutes, at least to some extent, in the seeding games, but Antetokounmpo is a one-man wrecking crew who presents problems for any opponent, including Boston. Sportsline's model is leaning over on the total, with Tatum and Brook Lopez projected to exceed their scoring averages. The model also says one side of the spread hits in well over 50% of simulations. You can only see that pick at Sportsline. So who wins Celtics vs. In episode 7 of the Umbrella Academy's second season, Allison has a bloody face-off with the villainous Swedes while Klaus tries to wrestle Ben out of his body. Backstreet Boys' Dance Y 1997 hit, Everybody, plays in the background, which shouldn't work, but oddly does. Music is its own character on the show, and it's fun to counterpoint a song against a scene where they shouldn't fit together but amazingly they do. Showrunner Steve Blackman recently told Parade of the Umbrella Academy Season 2 soundtrack. Though the second season finds the superhero siblings scattered throughout the 1960s, Blackman didn't mind including some anachronistic tunes. There was talk about all the music being only 60s music, but I didn't want to limit that, Blackman added. Music is timeless to me. If it's the right song, it's the right song. In fact, there's some new music too. The Umbrella Academy Season 2 trailer includes a new song from My Chemical Romance's Gerard Way, who co-created the graphic novels the series is based on alongside artist Gabriel Ba. Way explained in a statement at the time that he was inspired to write the aptly titled track, Here Comes the End, while the Netflix show was shooting its first season. By the time I finished it 2020 was in full swing, the world had taken a profound turn, and the song was finished in a surreal new reality, he said. From Frank Sinatra to Butthole Surfers, see every song in the Umbrella Academy Season 2 below. Episode 1, Right Back Where We Started, Beyond the Sea, by Bobby Darin, Right Back Where We Started, by Maxine Nightingale, My Way, by Frank Sinatra, You Must Be an Angel, by APM, Trying, by Fran Powers, Forever and a Day, by APM, I Wonder What the Future Holds for Me, by Glenn Snow, Twang Diddy, by Crucial Music, Rocket Fuel, by DJ Shadowfeet. De La Soul, Be Thankful You're You, by Fern Jones, Crazy, by Daniela Andrade, Comin' Home Baby, by Mel Torme, You Only Want Me When You're Lonely, by Jim Boyd Episode 2. The Frankel Footage, Babidi Babidi Boo, The Magic Song, by Perry Como, Take It All Off, by UPPM, Jive Me Baby, by APM, Who's That Knocking, by The Genies, I'm a Man, single version, by the Spencer Davis Group Episode 3, The Swedish Job, I Gotta Get the World Off My Back, by APM, Sunny, by Boney M, I Don't Care What They Say About You, by Mac and Gwen with the Country Playboys, Violin Partita No. 2 in D minor BWV 1004V. The FA Cup reaches a conclusion today as Arsenal and Chelsea clash at Wembley. But lifting the trophy is not the only thing at stake in the final. The London rivals each picked up £1.8 million for their victories in the FA Cup semi-finals. The Gunners stunned holders Manchester City as the Blues got the better of Manchester United, with both losing clubs earning £900,000 for their efforts. In addition to the trophy, today's FA Cup winners will receive £3.6 million in prize money. The competition's runners-up will be sent home with £1.8 million. Also see, what channel is Arsenal vs Chelsea on? TV, live stream for FA Cup final prize money. Find out how much Arsenal and Chelsea could win. Image, FA, normally, between the 3rd and 6th rounds. 45% of gate receipts goes to each club, with 10% going into a central pot. However, this year's final will be played behind closed doors due to the coronavirus pandemic. Arsenal and Chelsea will also receive a broadcasting fee as the showpiece will be televised live around the world. TV games offer great advertising opportunities, which also generates large sums for the FA Cup fund. FA Cup final prize money, who will come out on top? Image, Getty. Speaking in 2016, Andy Clifford, commercial director at Stadia Solutions, which specializes in the digital hoardings that run along the sides of the pitch, said, "Getting advertising access to the TV games remains very important. Advertisers don't believe the magic of the cup has worn off. We have not seen a slackening off in rates." According to The Telegraph, prize money could be cut next season as the FA deals with the financial crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic. The reports claims the FA's losses could be worth £300 million. The FA's chief executive, Mark Bullingham, said, "The high level of uncertainty in our landscape means that we have had to plan for a whole range of potential scenarios. As a not-for-profit organization, this will hit us hard. Therefore, over recent months, we have forensically analyzed the budget of every division within the FA in order to identify the most suitable areas to make cost savings. And the situation has worsened to a point where we now need to reduce the size of the FA in order to deal with the financial impact of the crisis." FA Cup final prize money, how will the action unfold? Image, Getty. FA Cup prize money breakdown. 2019-20 first round proper winners £40,36,000, second round proper winners £20,54,000, third round proper winners £32,135,000, fourth round proper winners £16,180,000, fifth round proper winners £8,360,000, quarter final winners £4,720,000, semi-final winners £2,1,800,000, semi-final losers £2,900,000, final runners-up £1,1,800,000, final winners £3,600,000. Small rocket builder Rocket Lab is going back to the launchpad in August, as the company said it diagnosed the cause of its recent launch failure and received approval from the Federal Aviation Administration to resume launches. "We were able to quickly reconstruct what happened, and the investigation board was able to confidently narrow down the issue to a single eligible connection," Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck told reporters during a briefing on Friday. The company's Electron rocket launched its 13th mission on July 4, carrying 7 small satellites bound for orbit. But the rocket never reached its destination, despite the early stages of the launch going according to plan, as a disconnection in its electrical system caused the rocket's engine to shut down. Rocket Lab says the root of the issue was an electrical system that wasn't secured, which led to the part overheating and then melting during flight. Alongside FAA investigators, the company reviewed over 25,000 channels of data from the launch to identify the cause of the accident. This disconnection was incredibly unusual because it was able to evade all of the pre-flight acceptance testing, Beck said. "It's a very sneaky and tricky issue to try and screen for." Rocket Lab has built more than 720 of these electrical components, Beck noted. The company made a slight change to its production process and will be screening for the issue in the rockets it's built. "Anybody who flies on Electron now is going to be flying on a more reliable vehicle than they did before," Beck said. Rocket Lab is the industry leader in building and launching small rockets, targeting the growing market of satellites and spacecraft that are anywhere between the size of a toaster to a refrigerator. Its Electron rocket is priced at about $7 million per launch and is 55 feet tall, or about a fifth the size of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. Started in 2006, the company has about 600 employees and is backed by a host of VC firms and, in recent years, has grown its valuation to more than $1.2 billion. It's based in Long Beach, California but was founded by Beck in New Zealand, where it has a privately built launchpad. Beck said that, "There was a financial loss from the July 4th failure, because we're not launching." But he downplayed the significance of that loss, saying that it wasn't really a big deal, and noting that the company still has cash set aside from its $140 million round of funding in November 2019. Rocket Lab has launched its Electron rocket to space 12 times. It first reached orbit in January 2018 and is closing in on beginning launches from a second pad in Virginia. The first launch from that U.S. location, called LC-2, will be a few weeks after the August launch, Beck said. We haven't launched this month and we're trying to be on a 1-month cadence, so we're at least 4 weeks behind, Beck added. To date, the company has successfully deployed 53 payloads. Fans waited patiently last night for Future and Lil Uzi Vert to drop what they thought was going to be a joint mixtape, or even a new song, but the two rappers didn't deliver. The rumor mill has been buzzing for weeks that Hendrix and Uzi were going to be releasing some sort of new music, especially after they were spotted shooting a visual last month. Then, Future and Lil Uzi added fuel to the fire when they both promoted a Hype Williams-directed visual on their Instagram pages last week. July 31st was displayed at the end of the clip, suggesting that something would be offered today. To add to that, Uzi's record label, Generation Now, posted the same video snippet to IG and in the comments section, told a fan that asked that a project was coming. The comment has since been deleted. However, after fans went through streaming services to find new music from the former XXL freshman, they came up empty-handed and now, they're pissed. One Twitter user wrote, "All that promo from Future and Lil Uzi Vert and they don't even release anything." Another said, "Lol, I am only upset with myself that I really thought Future and Uzi were gone drop today." A third person tweeted, "Was really hoping to wake up to that new Future x Uzi tape." At the moment, it's uncertain if the song or project will drop at all, but fans are venting their frustrations about it via social media, to say the least. Check out more reactions to Future and Lil Uzi Vert not dropping a mixtape like fans hoped they would below. See photos of every XXL freshman ever inducted into the freshman class over the years. An early tip-off time certainly didn't impact the Miami Heat against the Denver Nuggets as both teams embarked in their first meaningful game inside the NBA bubble in Orlando. What started out as an evenly matched contest in the first half turned into a blowout midway through the third quarter as the Heat began to get into a groove en route to a 125-105 win. Prior to the hiatus, Miami was the best three-point shooting team in the league, knocking down 38.3% of threes a night, and if there were any lingering questions on whether it would have an issue replicating that success in the bubble, today's game certainly answered that question. The Heat knocked down 13 three-pointers and shot 44.8% from deep against the Nuggets, as Denver failed to run shooters like Duncan Robinson and Jay Crowder off the line in the second half. The Nuggets entered this game down 3 starters, and it certainly had an impact as Nikola Jokic didn't have significant help around him to help win this game. Denver shouldn't be too concerned, though, as the team should be at full strength in time for the playoffs. Here are the main takeaways from Miami's win. Yes, it was the first game back, and, yes, the Nuggets were down 3 starters who likely would have made this game very different. However, it cannot be ignored the type of statement this Miami win made. It's not just Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo putting points on the board. In the second half, Duncan Robinson, Jay Crowder and even Kelly Olynyk all lit Denver's defense up from long range. Crowder went 3 of 4 from three-point range, and came up huge when the Nuggets were largely focused on stopping Robinson from going off from deep. Then, in the third quarter, Robinson broke free to finish the game with 17 points. Goran Dragic even had a strong showing, with 13 points and finishing the game with a +13. In the fourth quarter, though, it was the Olynyk show, as the reserve big man went off for 20 points. Olynyk played 24 minutes in the matchup, which is unusual as head coach Erik Spoelstra typically elects to play and start Meyers Leonard. However, for unknown reasons Leonard didn't see the court today, and Olynyk stepped up to put the game away for Miami. The Heat's depth isn't a secret, but after nearly 5 months off, it's a bit surprising that this team was able to pick right back up where they left off. This type of production, where 4 of the 5 starters finish in double figures and players like Olynyk put up big numbers, should be exciting for a Miami team that is looking to play spoiler to some of the top teams in the East when the playoffs begin. Adebayo has had a breakout season, which earned him All-Star recognition back in February. Robinson, meanwhile, has gained attention as being one of the best three-point shooters in the league. By Amir Vadat and John Gambrelltehran, Iran on Saturday said it detained an Iranian-American leader of a little-known California-based opposition group for allegedly planning a 2008 attack on a mosque that killed 14 people and wounded over 200 others. Iran's intelligence ministry also alleged Jamshid Sharmad of the Kingdom Assembly of Iran planned other attacks around the Islamic Republic amid heightened tensions between Tehran and the US over its collapsing 2015 nuclear deal with world powers. It was unclear how the 65-year-old Sharmad, whom Iran accused of running the opposition group's Tandar militant wing, ended up detained by intelligence officials. The intelligence ministry called it a complex operation, without elaborating. It published a purported picture of Sharmad, blindfolded, on its website. Iranian intelligence minister Mahmoud Alavi later appeared on state TV, saying Sharmad had been arrested in Iran, without elaborating. Requests for comment sent by email to the Glendora-based Kingdom Assembly of Iran were not immediately answered and a telephone number for the group no longer worked. The U State Department, which mentioned how Sharmad earlier had been targeted for assassination in a recent report called Outlaw Regime, a chronicle of Iran's destructive activities, acknowledged reports of his detention. The Iranian regime has a long history of detaining Iranians and foreign nationals on spurious charges, the State Department said in a statement. We urge Iran to be fully transparent and abide by all international legal standards. Iranian state television broadcast a report on Sharmad's arrest, linking him to the 2008 bombing of the Hosseini Said al-Shohada Mosque in Shiraz. It also said his group was behind a 2010 bombing at Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's mausoleum in Tehran that wounded several people. The report also alleged without providing evidence that Tandar, or Thunder, in Farsi, plotted attacks on a dam and planned to use cyanide bombs at Tehran's annual book fair. State TV later aired footage of Sharmad interspersed with footage from the moment of the 2008 explosion at the Shiraz Mosque. Sharmad's face appeared swollen and the style of the footage resembled one of what a rights group has identified as over 350 coerced confessions aired by the broadcaster over the last decade. The intelligence ministry has not said what charges Sharmad will face. Prisoners earlier accused in the same attack were sentenced to death and executed. The Kingdom Assembly of Iran, known in Farsi as Anjuman-e-Padeshahi-e-Iran, and Tandar seek to restore Iran's monarchy, which ended when the fatally ill Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fled the country in 1979 just before its Islamic Revolution. The group's founder disappeared in the mid-2000s. Iranian intelligence operatives in the past have used family members and other tricks to lure targets back to Iran or friendly countries to be captured. Washington, D.C. Champaign County GOP Representative Jim Jordan had a combative exchange on Friday with longtime National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Director Anthony Fauci over whether protests of police violence around the country are spreading coronavirus. Fauci, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Robert Redfield and Assistant HHS Secretary Brett Giroir on Friday testified before the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus. Other members of the bipartisan committee grilled them on subjects including development of a vaccine for the virus, the safety of reopening schools and President Donald Trump's handling of the crisis. Jordan, a Trump-allied co-founder of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, used his time to inveigh against government limits on church gatherings and business operations during the pandemic, while Black Lives Matter protests of police violence are allowed. Jordan argued that permitting protests while cracking down on church services amounts to favoring one First Amendment liberty over another. He asked Fauci whether the protests are spreading coronavirus. Crowding together, particularly when you're not wearing a mask, contributes to the spread of the virus. Fauci responded. Should we limit the protesting? Jordan continued. I'm not in a position to determine what the government can do in a forceful way, Fauci responded. I haven't seen people during a church service go out and harm police officers or burn buildings, Jordan continued. No limit to protests, but you can't go to church on Sunday. Jordan said Fauci had advocated for certain businesses to be shut down, arguing that he hadn't seen one hairstylist who, between haircuts, goes out and attacks police or sets something on fire, but we've seen all kinds of that stuff during protests and we know the protests actually increased the spread of the virus. You've said that. I said crowds, said Fauci. I didn't say protests do anything. Crowds are known, particularly when you don't have a mask, to increase the acquisition and transmission. After Jordan concluded, Maryland Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin noted that a recent Supreme Court decision found it constitutional to restrict the number of people who can attend a church service, as long as the same rule applies to other events like concerts, movies, spectator sports, and theatrical performances. Raskin, a constitutional law professor who often clashes with Jordan, observed that several large religious gatherings ended up being super-spreader events. There is no religious immunity to this disease, and there is no free exercise exemption to universal public health orders, said Raskin, who posted a video of his remarks on Twitter with a statement that said he wanted to dispel the thick fog of constitutional confusion left by Jim Jordan's disgraceful heckling of Dr. Fauci. 1/3 New York Liberty forward Sabrina Ionescu goes up for a shot as Seattle Storm guard Jewell Loyd-Wright watches during the second half of a WNBA basketball game, Saturday, July 25, 2020, in Ellenton, Florida. AP photo: Phelan M. Ebenhack. New York Liberty rookie Sabrina Ionescu has a grade 3 left ankle sprain according to the team. Ionescu, the top overall pick in the draft, injured her ankle in the second quarter against Atlanta and did not return to action in the Liberty's 84-78 loss to the Dream on Friday night. X-rays taken at a hospital came back negative, but the MRI revealed the sprain. A grade 3 sprain is the most severe and usually requires months to heal fully as it's a full tear of the ankle ligament. This level of sprain causes severe pain, swelling and bruising. A group of doctors have been attending to the injury. They are trying to get the swelling to decrease and increase her range of motion, according to the Liberty. Ionescu was bringing the ball up court and rolled her left ankle when she got tangled up with Atlanta's Bettany Alaney with about 5 minutes left in the opening half. She finished with 10 points on 4 of 5 shooting. LeBron James tweeted out after seeing the injury his well wishes to Ionescu to get healthy. Ionescu said in her diary for the Associated Press that James, among other NBA players, had reached out to her after her first game of the season. Ionescu played in only 2.5 games this season and might be hard-pressed to return with the WNBA playing a truncated season with only 19 games left over the next 6 weeks. New York is short-handed at guard already with Kia Nurse sidelined with a sprained left ankle she suffered in the team's opener. Asia Durr, the No. 2 pick last year, is out for the season on a medical exemption after contracting the coronavirus. "We're gonna have to huddle up and talk about it," Liberty coach Walt Hopkins said after the loss. "There's not a lot of ready-to-go options hanging around. See if we can get Kia right." Ionescu had been pretty durable in college for Oregon, only missing 4 games her freshman season. She played every game after that en route to shattering the NCAA career triple-double mark for both men and women, with 26 and became the first player in college history to have 2,000 points, 1,000 rebounds and 1,000 assists. The WNBA had set up a clean corridor, according to League Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. That way players who needed an X-ray or an MRI could go to a hospital to receive care without having to go back into quarantine when they return to IMG Academy in Florida where all the games are being played this season because of the pandemic. The Liberty are 0-3 on the season and will play again Sunday against Phoenix. _____ Follow Doug Feinberg on Twitter at http://twitter.com/Doug Feinberg. Copyright 2020 The Associated Press. All rights reserved. This material may not be published, broadcast, rewritten or redistributed without permission. Washington, Joseph R. Biden Jr. has entered the final stage of his deliberations about choosing a running mate as he prepares to talk one-on-one with the finalists next week, while Democratic leaders lobby him furiously to elevate their allies and sink their enemies. Mr. Biden's campaign has conducted extensive polling and focus groups with voters on a collection of candidates and weighed an array of factors, such as the impact of the pick in battleground states, and whether to choose a black woman. Aides say the announcement will come the week before the Democratic convention in August. 2 candidates who received scant attention early in the process are now among the leading contenders: Representative Karen Bass of California and Susan E. Rice, the former national security advisor, according to Democratic officials briefed on the selection process. Ms. Bass in particular has moved rapidly toward the top of Mr. Biden's list amid an intensive lobbying drive by her fellow House Democrats, and has impressed the former vice president's search committee. Mr. Biden is said to be focused on finding a running mate he regards as capable of advancing his priorities in governing and who can be counted on not to stray from the urgent challenges facing the nation to pursue their own political priorities, according to people familiar with his thinking. His advisors would also prefer a running mate who would not present a rich political target for President Trump, given that the incumbent is lagging badly in the polls and has so far struggled to deliver credible negative attacks against Mr. Biden. James E. Clyburn, the third-ranking House Democrat who helped revive Mr. Biden's campaign in South Carolina, said he had been bombarded by supporters of several candidates. "I've heard from the surrogates of about all the people in the race," said Mr. Clyburn, who did not rule out making a late, private recommendation to Mr. Biden. In conversations with Mr. Biden and his vetting committee, lawmakers have recommended Ms. Bass as a consensus candidate who is well liked across partisan and factional lines and would be a loyal lieutenant to him in government. Ms. Bass has reinforced that message by assuring Democratic officials that she has no interest in seeking the presidency herself, according to lawmakers directly familiar with the discussions. That commitment could assuage concerns in the Biden camp that he might be overshadowed by a running mate positioning herself to succeed him. Ms. Bass has also waged a previously undisclosed campaign to woo influential liberal leaders, telephoning union presidents to seek their counsel and support. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is close with Ms. Bass, whom she named to oversee the recent policing reform bill, and has made her admiration clear in private conversations, including with former President Barack Obama. It's Friday, the final day we'll hear the legendary Mike Golic on the airwaves with ESPN Radio. Again, a reminder he'll still be on the air with ESPN as a college football analyst going forward. The tributes have been pouring in, including from his former Mike and Mike partner Mike Greenberg. We'll hear what Golic has to say as he signs off later on Friday, but before the end of his decades-plus long run, he spoke with Sarah Spain on the That's What She Said podcast. He addressed both Mike and Golic and Wingo ending, and he's done in the past. He was honest and upfront about his feelings. "I guess from the standpoint of Greeny wanting to do something else, and that's all been well documented, I wish he'd have come to me and kind of was a little more upfront about it," he said. "But that's obviously in the past. And, listen, everybody has a right to try and go do what they want. He wanted to do something else. But I knew I was keeping the morning show." He then said Trey Wingo's familiarity was a good fit. But as for their show ending? Whether Trey wanted to do that or not, to me, wasn't the issue, he said. If he didn't want to do it, and it was going to change, I thought, well, I should still be on the show, and let's just change it. Then, he said that he first heard from media reports that his run was ending. Unfortunately, the tough time this time around is I basically heard it was ending through the media. Which, to me, isn't the best way to find something out. I don't think that's the right way. But they didn't ask me, so what I thought was the right way, it's business. At the end of the day, it's business. I've always said this about football, and it's true in anything. You've got to be careful at taking things too personally. Thanks to Awful Announcing for sharing. Let friends in your social network know what you are reading about NHL season, which has been shut down since March because of the coronavirus pandemic, gets back underway with 5 games Saturday. A link has been sent to your friend's email address. A link has been posted to your Facebook feed. Sports Pulse, USA Today Sports' Mackenzie Salmon spoke with Theo Fleury about the NHL's restart tournament and why he believes it will be a must-watch. USA Today: the hardest trophy to win in professional sports just got a little harder. Facing an unprecedented hiatus in March because of the coronavirus pandemic, the NHL revamped its traditional 16-team playoff format by adding 8 teams in another round. Usually there are 4 best-of-7 series, but now a team could play as many as 33 games before being awarded the Stanley Cup. It all gets underway this weekend with 5 games Saturday and another 5 on Sunday. Games will be played in Toronto, Eastern Conference, and Edmonton, Western Conference. Under the 24-team format, the top 4 teams in each conference will each play 3 games in a round-robin to determine seeding, while the remaining 8 conference teams will play best-of-5 series in a qualifying round to determine who advances. There is no bracket, teams will be reseeded after each round. Defenseman Alex Pietrangelo and the St. Louis Blues will be defending their Stanley Cup championship at the Edmonton Hub. Photo, Winslow Townsend, USA Today Sports. Predictions. How the qualifying round, Stanley Cup playoffs will unfold. Burning questions. Will the 2-hub city format actually work? Power rankings. Sizing up the 24 teams left in the postseason field, but teams also catch a break because there will be no travel until the 2 remaining Eastern Conference teams fly to Edmonton for the conference final. No fans are allowed in either building, meaning there is no home ice advantage. Though players say it will be hard without fans providing energy, there is a side benefit: they won't have to shout and can hear each other better. Our zone exits, our breakouts, our communication will be a little easier without the crowd noise, Flyers defenseman Matt Niskanen told reporters. The weekend schedule, with time, TV, * round robin, New York Rangers vs. Carolina Hurricanes, noon, NBCSN, streamed on Chicago Blackhawks vs. Edmonton Oilers, 3, NBC Florida Panthers vs. New York Islanders, 4 NBCSN, Montreal Canadiens vs. Pittsburgh Penguins, 8, NBC Winnipeg Jets vs. Calgary Flames, 10:30, NBCSN, Arizona Coyotes vs. Nashville Predators, 2, USA, * Philadelphia Flyers vs. Boston Bruins, 3, NBC * Street, Louis Blues vs. Colorado Avalanche, 6:30 p.m., NBCSN, Columbus Blue Jackets vs. Toronto Maple Leafs, 8, NHL Network Minnesota Wild vs. Vancouver Canucks, 10:30, NBCSN, full schedule, dates, times for qualifying round, round-robin play. If all goes well, the tournament will run into early October, which would shatter the record for the latest a Stanley Cup has been awarded. Charges will not be brought against Darren Wilson, the white former police officer who fatally shot Michael Brown, a black 18-year-old, in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. The decision comes nearly 6 years after a grand jury declined to prosecute Wilson. St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell said his office spent 5 months reinvestigating the case at the request of Brown's family. Could we prove beyond a reasonable doubt that when Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown, he committed murder or manslaughter under Missouri law? After an independent and in-depth review of the evidence, we cannot prove that he did, Bell told reporters Thursday. I know this is not the result the family was looking for, and their pain will continue forever, Bell said. Brown was killed on August 9, 2014 after Wilson encountered him and a friend on Canfield Drive in Ferguson. The DOJ investigation cleared Wilson, but it issued a scathing indictment of the Ferguson Police Department as a whole, claiming officers routinely violated the rights of black residents. Brown's death set off unrest in the streets of Ferguson and, along with the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin, sparked the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Prosecutor not charging Ferguson officer who killed Michael Brown via ABC News. Com. The former police officer who fatally shot Michael Brown 6 years ago in Ferguson, Missouri, July 30, 2029 13 p.m. Editorial credit. Katz, Shutterstock.com. In the nearly 2 decades after she helped the U.S. win its first World Championships team title, Taran Humphrey established herself as one of the most influential figures in American gymnastics. Serving on USA Gymnastics' 3-member selection committee for the Olympic and World Championships team, Humphrey played a key role in shaping what emerged as the greatest dynasty in international gymnastics, perhaps in any Olympic sport, this century. The second most powerful woman in gymnastics, Gymcastic, the influential podcast, claimed in a 2013 headline on its website, the most powerful woman being longtime U national team coordinator Martha Caroli. Humphrey today is estranged from her sport and USA Gymnastics, the Indianapolis-based nonprofit national governing body with $91 million in assets now battling for its survival in the wake of the Larry Nassar sexual abuse scandal. Humphrey, who in an exclusive interview with the Southern California News Group alleges she was sexually assaulted by Nassar in 2002, was fired as a member of the selection committee and as a USA Gymnastics athlete representative in May 2019 after posting comments on her Facebook page that some critics said condoned abusive coaching practices. Humphrey said she was driven out of her USA Gymnastics positions by Li Leung, the organization's fourth CEO since March 2017, who Humphrey accused of misleading her and continuing a culture of cover-ups that existed under previous USA Gymnastics CEO Steve Penny. Humphrey was fired shortly after she found out she was pregnant with her first child. "They publicly fired me while I was pregnant," Humphrey said. "Discarded me like I was trash." Humphrey, an NCAA champion at Alabama, acknowledges she is a polarizing figure in American gymnastics, a position she said causes her deep pain. To some in the sport, including several Nassar survivors, Humphrey was a tone-deaf member of Penny and Karolyi's inner circle who, while in a position of influence, failed to speak out against a culture of abuse that was prevalent during Martha and Bella Karolyi's tenure as U national team directors. Others like Olympic medalist Kathy Johnson-Clark see Humphrey as a convenient fall girl for USA Gymnastics, thrown under the bus by an organization looking to take heat off itself while failing to address the rampant abuse in the sport in a substantive way. "I think she was a scapegoat," said Johnson-Clark, a member of the groundbreaking 1984 U Olympic team. USA Gymnastics' removal of Humphrey, Johnson-Clark continued, makes them look like they're taking action. "They can say, 'We're listening.' But really you're just running circles around the real issues." Humphrey, in an interview, details how Penny tried to influence the selection of Olympic and World Championship teams, and ordered her and other USA Gymnastics officials not to discuss Nassar after the scandal became public shortly after the 2016 Olympic Games. She also described how after a rocky transition to distance learning last spring, Georgia teacher Amy Rodriguez-Webb is determined to do better this fall. She bought a dry erase board and a special camera to display worksheets, and she set up her dining room to broadcast school lessons. Related, desperate parents pay whatever they can to escape online schools. "I'm getting myself geared up for what I feel will prepare me and allow me to teach remotely with more fidelity now that I know what I want it to look like," Rodriguez-Webb said. She and other teachers from suburban Atlanta's Cobb County School District recently started 3 weeks of training as they prepare to launch the school year virtually. With remote learning part of an increasing number of fall reopening plans, districts are facing pressure to improve after many students got left behind this spring in the scramble to close schools during the coronavirus pandemic. But investment in training varies widely. While some school systems have offered new guidance on teaching from afar, many educators feel like they're on their own. More affluent school districts have used the summer to train teachers both on technology and getting the most from students who are learning at least partly online, according to Richard Ferdig, an education technology researcher at Kent State University. "Teachers in those districts will perform well," he said. "For the have-nots, I'm concerned, not that they couldn't do it, but that they weren't necessarily given the right things to do it," said Ferdig, who edits the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, which released a special issue and online book dedicated to professional development during the pandemic. "They've either been given nothing or they've been told, 'Here's the tools we bought for you,' with very little support on how to integrate those tools into teaching." Many teachers were frustrated by the unplanned experiment in distance learning, a change most weren't prepared for given how few schools had virtual components and how little their own college education focused on teaching both in person and online. A poll of 1,500 Washington state teachers said 79% wanted more professional development or training before the start of the school year, with 23% of those saying they need significant training to be more effective in the fall, said Linda Mullen, spokeswoman for the Washington Education Association, which surveyed its members. "They want to do better," Mullen said. In New York, polls indicated that parent dissatisfaction with distance learning increased as school closures persisted. That was especially true among families in high-needs districts, where instruction was less likely to mirror a typical classroom. We kind of just threw them out there and gave them a Zoom link or gave them a Google Hangout or a Google Classroom, said Dia Bryant, Deputy Director for the Education Trust New York, which conducted the polls. Poseidon Water could be headed back to the drawing board to better compensate for the marine life expected to be killed by its proposed desalination plant in Huntington Beach. After hearings this week for one of two remaining major permits needed for the project, several members of the Regional Water Quality Control Board indicated they were dissatisfied with the proposed mitigation for the larvae and other small marine life that would die as a result of the plant's ocean intake pipes. I don't think this mitigation comes close to addressing the impacts this project will have, said Regional Board Director Daniel Selmy on Friday evening, July 31st, near the end of 2 10-hour days of online hearings and public testimony for the proposed permit. While advocates applauded the controversial project for creating a drought-proof source of drinking water for Orange County, foes told the regional board that the water isn't needed, is too expensive, will unnecessarily harm marine life and disproportionately burden low-income households. But the primary concern of regional board members focused on the proposed mitigation at Bolsa Chica wetlands as well as the lack of details in Poseidon's mitigation plan. The board will meet August 7 to discuss how to address those issues. Among the possibilities discussed Friday was a requirement that Poseidon to build an artificial reef to promote sea life, in addition to the work proposed for the Bolsa Chica wetlands. The new issues represent the latest bureaucratic hiccup for the $1 billion project, which has been in the works since 1998. And it's the third time since 2006 that Poseidon has been before the regional board for a permit, thanks to previous permits expiring and new regulations being put on the books. Poseidon Vice President Scott Maloney, who's overseeing the project, took heart that the conditions linked to the permit on Friday have, so far, remained unchanged from conditions recommended by the regional board staff. And while many opponents would like to see the permit rejected completely, board concerns appeared limited to mitigation requirements. After 2 days of testimony, the facts supporting the proposed permit, and staff recommendation to approve the renewed permit, are unchanged, he said after the meeting. We are pleased that so many local teachers, Bolsa Chica conservationists, water district leaders, elected officials and residents voiced their support for the project. We look forward to the board deliberations on Friday, August 7th. A total of 76 speakers supported the project, including trade union representatives eager for jobs constructing the $1 billion plant and San Diego County backers of Poseidon's existing desalination operation in Carlsbad. Several county business groups also said they backed the plant. To anyone who doubted the potential quality of basketball within the bubble, I submit Friday's game between the Dallas Mavericks and Houston Rockets as evidence that the NBA won't miss a beat. In a thrilling overtime bout that featured a double-digit fourth-quarter comeback, the Rockets stunned the Mavericks 153-149. The win will prove critical in the standings, as the Rockets now lead the Mavericks by 2. 5 games with only 7 to play. In all likelihood, that condemns Dallas to a first-round series against the Los Angeles Clippers. James Harden and Russell Westbrook were the drivers behind the comeback for Houston. The duo combined for 80 points, 20 rebounds and 16 assists. Danuel House chipped in 6 three-pointers as well to support them, and despite their horrible defense, they managed to overcome a Dallas team that made 21 three-pointers and got at least 24 points from 4 separate players: Kristaps Porzingis, Luka Doncic, Tim Hardaway Jr., Trey Burke. Both of these teams have a ways to go in terms of conditioning. This track meet proved that. But on only the second day of the bubble, we got what was potentially the game of the year. Here are the main takeaways from Houston's victory. The Rockets are the most intentionally flawed championship contender in NBA history. They are fully aware of all of the things that they can't do, and while Friday proved they are capable of winning in spite of them, they're still there. They lost the rebounding battle 55-43, and times it looked much worse. The Mavericks grabbed 13 offensive rebounds. Houston isn't good enough defensively to give away that many second-chance opportunities. Kristaps Porzingis, and to a lesser extent Boban Marjanovic, both shot over the smaller Rockets with ease. There is no universe in which allowing 149 points is sustainable or acceptable. Again, this was by design. The Rockets are betting that their overwhelming shooting advantage and ability to switch comfortably on defense against the most valuable opposing shots is enough to overcome those deficits. But they nearly weren't on Friday. The Rockets don't need to rebound like the Bucks to win the championship, but there is still improvement necessary if they hope to win the championship. As a driver, Harden thrives primarily based off of patience and deceleration. Even without being particularly fast, he starts and stops and changes directions so fluidly that it hardly matters. But on Friday, Harden looked faster than he had before the season shut down. Perhaps 4 months of rest did him some good. Given the enormous offensive load he carries, this hiatus might have done him some good. Combining the sort of speed we glimpsed against the Mavericks with his impeccable skill creates an unstoppable scorer. The Mavericks have the most efficient offense in NBA history, the third best net rating in the Western Conference, and 2 young stars. Yet they're still in 7th place in the standings. Why? They struggle in clutch settings. By Alana Kramer, MD, Family Medicine. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, the way people live everyday life has changed, especially for seniors. Seniors are a vulnerable population that should continue to practice social distancing and wear a face covering when leaving the house for essential errands. As you age, your body may not pick up on warning signs that are crucial to your health. It's important to know these warning signs during the summer, especially the signs of thirst and dehydration. As the weather begins to warm up, it's especially important for seniors to make sure you are taking the appropriate precautions to stay cool and hydrated. Some of the leading cases for hospital visits in those older than 60 during the summer are dehydration and heat stroke. If dehydration is untreated, it can turn into heat stroke, so it's important to know the signs, ways to prevent them, and how they can negatively affect your health and body. Dehydration occurs when your body loses more fluids than it has taken in. This means there is not enough water and other important fluids in your body. As you grow older, your brain reacts slower to the sense of thirst. This decreased sense, combined with age-related memory loss, can make it especially difficult to remember to drink water throughout the day. Anyone can become dehydrated, but it is particularly dangerous as you age. Untreated dehydration can be life-threatening, so it's important to be aware of the signs and symptoms. These include, if these primary signs are overlooked, severe dehydration can occur, which can lead to other heat-related health issues. Heat stroke is a life-threatening emergency and occurs when your body overheats due to overexertion during physical activity or prolonged exposure to heat, usually in combination with dehydration. Over time, your body becomes less efficient at regulating its temperature. Even a short walk in the heat can be dangerous if you don't take the proper precautions. Common symptoms include, seniors, you should be aware of your water intake and how often you are exposed to the sun. It's helpful to have scheduled drinking times to ensure you are drinking enough water throughout the day. You also should carry a water bottle everywhere you go to make sure you always have access to fresh water or hit small goals throughout the day. Staying well hydrated helps prevent serious complications, which is why it's important to take the proper precautions. You can tell if you are properly hydrated by monitoring your urine color. Generally, a light yellow color or clear urine indicates you are properly hydrated. Long-term dehydration or heat stroke can seriously affect the brain, heart, kidneys and muscles, especially in those older than 60. Failure to prevent these conditions puts you at an increased risk of. Prevention tips include, it's beneficial for seniors to understand the importance of staying hydrated, especially during the summer. Los Angeles, on Election Day in the spring of 1968, 14-year-old Karen Bass was going door to door, trying to persuade her Los Angeles neighbors to vote for Robert F. Kennedy in the Democratic presidential primary. The charismatic candidate had energized young voters with a campaign focused on economic justice and racial equality. The teenage Bass saw him not just as a progressive politician, but as the activist she wanted to be. That night, as Kennedy left the Los Angeles rally celebrating his primary win, he was shot to death. The coalition that Kennedy had assembled crumbled over the next few months, and Richard M. Nixon, RFK's polar opposite, was elected president. That outcome left its mark on Bass, who had already grieved the murders of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. "I realized it's not about a single individual leading the charge," she said in a recent interview. "The assassinations I saw growing up taught me that every time you had a major leader lost, things fell apart." Today Karen Bass, 66, is a veteran politician in California and head of the Congressional Black Caucus. She's a bona fide progressive, a congresswoman in her fifth term who has trounced her opponents in every race she's run, a former physician's assistant with a health sciences degree, a stalwart advocate for women and children, a longtime promoter of police reform and the first African American woman in the nation's history to lead a state legislative house. Yet among voters outside of California, her name often draws a blank. Even as she is under serious consideration to be Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate on the Democratic ticket, she has one of the lowest public profiles among the top contenders. She's famously reluctant to be photographed, and only recently have the national media begun to pay her serious attention. What might seem like uncommon reticence for a politician on the national stage, however, looks different to observers and journalists who have watched Bass work for decades in Los Angeles, as a community-driven operator whose low profile is a key part of her effectiveness, not an obstacle to success. It's not a calculated political style. It's just her authentic self. And people have always seemed to respond to that, says her longtime mentor and Black LA political dean Mark Ridley Thomas. In 1990, as a community activist in South Los Angeles, Bass founded a local nonprofit called the Community Coalition, with the mantra of, "No celebrity-style leadership." The phrase was written in the founding documents and was part of every orientation. "If you're here to make a name for yourself," Bass would say to new employees, "you should find another place to work." When she was elected to the California State Assembly in 2004, she carried that attitude into her political career. The Orlando Magic's Jonathan Isaac became the first NBA player to stand for the national anthem as the league resumed play after a 20-week hiatus due to the coronavirus pandemic. The television broadcast showed Isaac, who is black, standing as players and coaches from both teams, as well as referees, took a knee during the playing of the national anthem. The 22-year-old forward was also the only player seen not wearing a "Black Lives Matter" shirt. Isaac can be seen wearing his Magic game jersey instead. Social media observers questioned why he chose to abstain from the league-wide protest. "I'm very curious about, and will be patient for, Jonathan Isaac's explanation here," tweeted basketball writer Dane Moore. "Standing for the anthem is one thing, but seeming to be intentional about not wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. I dunno, man. Drag me, I don't care," said another Twitter user. "What Jonathan Isaac did was his right to do. I lost no respect for him and still respect him for who he is. If a player stands or kneels, I could care less." The owners of the Magic, the DeVos family, released a statement in support of the players' pregame protest on Friday. The statement did not allude to Isaac's decision to stand. The DeVos family and the Orlando Magic organization fully supports Magic players who have chosen to leverage their professional platform to send a peaceful and powerful message condemning bigotry, racial injustice and the unwarranted use of violence by police, especially against people of color, the statement said. It added, "We are proud of the positive impact our players have made and join with them in the belief that sports can bring people together, bridging divides and promoting inclusion, equality, diversity and unity. We know this is not about the military, the men and women who serve honorably to keep our communities safe for all, or those who have paid the ultimate price to provide freedom, including freedom of expression. We're confident the entire Magic family has immense respect for these entities and individuals," the statement said. "This is about coming together to end racism once and for all. We are committed to walking alongside our players, today and in the many days ahead, in the pursuit of lasting and impactful change." The Magic are taking on the Brooklyn Nets in the league's third game of the resumed season in Orlando. Last night, every NBA player who restarted the league's 2020 season kneeled during the national anthem while wearing "Black Lives Matter" shirts. Moments before tip-off on Thursday evening, players with the New Orleans Pelicans and the Utah Jazz, joined by coaches and game officials, all took a knee. The Los Angeles Lakers and Los Angeles Clippers followed suit ahead of their game in Orlando. Less than a day after President Donald Trump announced he is banning TikTok from the United States, the app released a message assuring all users that the short-form video platform is not planning on going anywhere. Business Insider previously reported that Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One on Friday night that he is banning the Chinese-owned platform from the U.S. U.S. General Manager Vanessa Pappas appeared in a 1-minute video released Saturday morning addressing the TikTok community, in response to Trump's announcement. "We've heard your outpouring of support and we want to say thank you. We're not planning on going anywhere," Pappas said. TikTok is a home for creators and artists to express themselves, their ideas, and connect with others across different backgrounds, and we are so proud of all the various communities that call TikTok their home. Pappas thanked the 500 U.S. employees who work on this app every day, and mentioned the platform's plans for an additional 10,000 jobs we're bringing into this country over the next 3 years. The administration's previous threats to ban the app set alarms off among creators, but Pappas reiterated the app's plans for a $1 billion U.S. creator fund. Trump's comment to reporters came after a month of his administration publicly threatening to ban the app, with officials like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo citing concerns about the app's ties to China and the possible sharing of user data with the Chinese Communist Party. TikTok has denied that it would share user information with the Chinese government. Pappas acknowledged the app's plans for safety and security by saying, "We're building the safest app because we know it's the right thing to do. We appreciate the support, we're here for the long run, continue to share your voice here and let's stand for TikTok," Pappas said. A message to the TikTok community. After the TikTok's US debut in 2018, the app has attracted more than 80 million users and more than 2.3 billion downloads worldwide, Business Insider previously reported. Trump told reporters he planned to take action as soon as Saturday, but the White House had not released any plans as of Saturday morning. In addition to banning the app, Trump also threatened an executive order that would force TikTok's Chinese parent company, ByteDance, to divest from the app's U.S. operations. Reuters reported on Saturday that the company agreed to divesting, placing Microsoft as the new owner of TikTok in the U.S. The concession will test whether Trump's threat to ban TikTok is a negotiating tactic or whether he is intent on cracking down on a social media app that has up to 80 million daily active users in the United States, the outlet noted. President Donald Trump on Friday told reporters that he would ban popular video streaming platform TikTok as early as Saturday, and the social media platform's expansive community reacted in the way they know best, by posting memes. U.S. officials have long expressed security concerns over TikTok since it was purchased by the Chinese company ByteDance in 2017. In December 2019, the U.S. military announced that service members would no longer be permitted to use the app on their government-issued devices. In February, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer likewise expressed concerns over TikTok's connections to China in urging the Transportation Security Administration to cease its use of the platform as part of its social media campaigns. TikTok has said it does not share the data of its American users with Chinese officials. The platform, known as before it was purchased by ByteDance, didn't seem to land in the president's crosshairs until July, just a few weeks after his June rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Following the rally, users on the platform took credit for a social media campaign that may have impacted the event's attendance. It's not exactly clear how the president could ban TikTok, the app available to download for free on the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store. As The Verge noted, enacting a ban is not as simple as Trump and his allies have suggested, though there are ways he and his administration could make it more difficult for the company to operate. Sources told Reuters on Saturday that ByteDance has agreed to divest its U.S. operations to avoid a ban on TikTok. ByteDance had previously sought to maintain a stake in the U.S. business of TikTok, though the company has agreed to exit completely as part of a sale to Microsoft, according to the report. In a video posted Monday, the head of U.S. TikTok operations thanked users for the outpouring of support in response to Trump's proposed ban and said the app was here for the long run. Some TikTok creators posted videos joking they'd show up to the White House if Trump followed through with his TikTok ban. In typical TikTok form, the posts about the app's possible demise relied on popular trends and sounds from the app's user-generated library. In one video, a TikTok user envisioned they'd show up to the White House to confront Trump wielding a saucepan. The video uses a popular sound that originated from an episode of Lifetime's popular series, Dance Moms. # green screen # for you # for you page ## fy #FYP #hashtag TikTok ban # TikTok banned # TikTok Claudia Conway, the daughter of White House advisor Kellyanne Conway, who became a TikTok sensation when she began posting pro-Black Lives Matter and anti-Trump TikTok videos, joined in the meme-making. Conway made several videos that poked fun at Trump and his potential TikTok ban. Alan Berezovsky Getty Images. A lot has changed since Alanis Morissette released her last studio album 8 years ago. She now has 3 children with her husband, Solai Treadway, Ever, age 9, Onyx, age 4, and Winter, who is about to turn 1 via Popsugar. Naturally, the singer's newest release, Such Pretty Forks in the Road, features songs that, while having the same trademark Morissette cadence and feel, are about different themes than the angry, vindictive heartbreak we used to associate with the Canadian-born star's music. Case in point, the song, Ablaze, is about her children, as evidenced by Morissette's performance of the second track from Such Pretty Forks in the Road on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon via Rolling Stone. The star sings, Ablaze, while holding Onyx, who adorably has no idea her mama is performing for millions of people, but Morissette doesn't mind. She shows the love and patience of a parent who is used to doing way more than one thing at a time. And if you listen to the lyrics, you'll hear just how much the star adores her kids, and how high her hopes are for their future. Ablaze, lyrics give us insight into Morissette's life as a moment. Ablaze, the singer croons, one became 2 and then everyone was out for themselves, and then, they seem to easily forget we are made of the same cells, via AZ lyrics. This could be about the daily struggles of parenting. Morissette also describes her son as, all that energy so wild. She sings about her daughter, to my girl, to your innocence and fire, when you reach out, I am here hell or high water, this nest is never going away. In the chorus of the song, she states her purpose is to keep the light ablaze in their eyes. For the rest of her children's lives, Morissette sings, and this cord is unbreakable. She also tells her brood they will always be a family. The singer even acknowledges her kids may inherit some of her struggles with mental illness. She chants, it might feel dark, it might feel lonely and you'll wonder why you're here, you may be overcome with darkness and a sense of hopelessness, but it won't matter if you keep your core connected to the oneness. We love getting to know this side of Morissette. It's clear that although parenting isn't easy, it makes a light come ablaze inside the star. Happy August. We've got a relatively easy month of astro weather, at least compared to all the retrogrades and eclipses that defined June and July. Plus, Mercury's post-retrograde shadow has finally passed. The big events this month are the full moon in Aquarius on August 3rd and the new moon in Leo on August 18th. Use these lunations to reflect on your goals and set new intentions and manifestations. Enjoy the next few weeks of Leo season, because on August 22nd, Virgo season begins, ending the glamorous, life of the party summer vibes. This productive energy can be rewarding, so put it to good use. This content is imported from Embed Name. You may be able to find the same content in another format, or you may be able to find more information at their website. Read your monthly horoscope by sign: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. Erica W. Smith, Senior Astrology Editor. As Cosmopolitan's Senior Astrology Editor, Erica works with the Cosmos Council members to help you decode your birth chart and prepare for every Mercury retrograde. This content is created and maintained by a third party, and imported onto this page to help users provide their email addresses. You may be able to find more information about this and similar content at piano.io. Zack Snyder wished Aquaman star Jason Momoa a happy birthday on his official Vero page. Today is Jason Momoa's 41st birthday, and the actor is receiving a whole lot of love from fans, friends and colleagues. Justice League director Zack Snyder, who cast Momoa as Aquaman for Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, was one of the many people who sent their birthday wishes to the actor. Earlier today, Zack Snyder took to Vero to wish Aquaman star Jason Momoa a happy birthday by sharing a behind-the-scenes photo from Justice League. In it, Momoa can be seen behind the Justice League Batman cowl worn by Ben Affleck. You can check out the photo below. Vero, happy birthday Jason, from Zack Snyder. From DC_Cinematic, Jason Momoa is set to reprise his role as Arthur Curry in Warner Bros. And DC's yet-to-be-titled Aquaman sequel. David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick is writing the script of Aquaman 2, with James Wan expected to return to the director's chair. The film is currently set for a December 2022 release. In the meantime, Jason Momoa's Aquaman will next be seen in Zack Snyder's Justice League cut, which is coming to the Warner Media streaming service HBO Max. Here's the original synopsis for the movie. Fueled by his restored faith in humanity and inspired by Superman's selfless act, Bruce Wayne enlists the help of his newfound ally, Diana Prince, to face an even greater enemy. Together, Batman and Wonder Woman work quickly to find and recruit a team of metahumans to stand against this newly awakened threat. But despite the formation of this unprecedented League of Heroes, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Cyborg and The Flash, it may already be too late to save the planet from an assault of catastrophic proportions. Directed by Zack Snyder, Justice League stars Ben Affleck, Henry Cavill, Amy Adams, Gal Gadot, Ezra Miller, Jason Momoa, Ray Fisher, Jeremy Irons, Diane Lane, Connie Nielsen, J.K. Simmons, and Kieran Hines. Justice League is now available on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Stay tuned for the latest news surrounding Zack Snyder and Aquaman star Jason Momoa, and make sure to subscribe to Heroic Hollywood's YouTube channel for more content. Source: Vero, via Reddit.